The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para-X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
Step outside of your comfort zone. See the world with a whole new perspective. Join us and experience the unexplained on the Paranormal View.
And welcome everybody right here to the Paranormal View on the Para-X Radio Network. I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight. Those listening in the chat room and those listening from around the world. We appreciate each and every one of you. Got a great show lined up for tonight, and I hope everybody is doing well, staying safe from COVID. And in my area, it's supposed to be very, very cold for the next week. Not much snow, but really cold temperatures down like around 0. So there's even one day it's supposed to be with the wind chill minus. So that's going to be cold. So with that, we got like I say, a great show lined up for tonight, and going to have a lot to talk about. And we got with us tonight Barbara Duncan.
Good evening, everyone.
And we got Jeffrey Gould.
Hello, hello.
All right. And Jeff, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest and we can get started.
All right. Well, here in balmy 70-degree Los Angeles, tonight we have our favorite returning guest, Thomas Wertman. He's former co-director at, but still works with the Cleveland Ufology Project, and a former dean at the American National University, the state director of MUFON. Having studied business human resources at Kaplan University, Thomas has learned to read people when it comes to interviewing UFO witnesses and abductees. So welcome back, Thomas Wertman.
Thank you for having me back.
Now, excuse me. You haven't been on for quite a while, and people really miss you. I know we do. So
it's nice to be wanted. Sometimes you get that feeling. Would you just go away by now? Come on.
Well, you might be wanted.
It's also nice to be wanted not by people in black suits.
Right.
That's true. That is true. I have been in a few situations where I've looked over my shoulder quite a few times.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Oh yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I did one with a reported witness to a autopsy at Wright-Patterson. And that was actually, Henry, before I became state director.
Wow.
At that time, the gentleman in charge of media for MUFON called up our state director, at that time, Kathy Richards, and said, I've got an assignment for Tom, and I checked with our international director, and he gave me the go-ahead that we need him for a special assignment to interview a witness. And he wouldn't even tell her who the witness was, what it was all about, anything, any details whatsoever. And when he called me up, he says, I'm talking to you about a Wright-Patterson autopsy witness. And he says, there's only 2 people besides you that knows what you're doing. And he goes, that's me and our international director at the time. And he goes, we want you to talk to this witness about what he observed. And when I went to talk to the witness center, they actually called me up, MUFON did, and verified, basically that I got there. When I conducted the interview on the way back, they called me multiple times to make sure I made it out, basically. And I told them I did have the impression I was being followed because I went off the highway a few times. Not veering off the highway bad, but turned off the highway off some off ramps and got back on, and the same car kept following me.
Yeah, you was being followed then.
Yeah, so it kind of made me wonder about that. The whole thing about the autopsy witness is still kind of in question because there's some details that didn't quite add up. And originally they got the impression that he didn't observe just an autopsy, he observed a live alien, which wasn't the case. He just claimed he walked into a medical room down at Wright-Patterson where he was stationed at. And he was in the medical department, which he did prove all of his verification of his IDs, everything else, his position, stuff like that. And he did know some of the people down there at that time. And he mentioned their names, and I verified those. But when I was questioning about parts of the building where certain what stuff was at, I just kind of got a vague feeling that, something wasn't quite accurate. That, he really couldn't point out on maps where certain places were at, what buildings certain things were in. And I thought, if you're down there for several years, I don't think you would forget, where you observed an alien at, what building it was in, and so forth. So that was kind of in question.
Is it sort of like Area 51 where, they black out the windows on the plane and you can't talk to anybody else and you're only in a certain area and sometimes isolated from the other people that are on the base? So, could it be that paranoid of an operation?
I don't know if it was that paranoid because, see, down at Wright-Patterson, you also have Wright University.
Right.
And Wright University is in the same area.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they share some resources between each other. Now, a number of things at Wright-Patterson are actually below ground. But I was asking, if, you walked in on this autopsy, what building were you in at the medical facility? What building you're in? He mentioned that he was in a morgue. And I'm like, did they really have a morgue there? Or was it part of like a hospital itself that he was at? And he was just kind of really vague about the answers on that. So I was kind of really questioning that.
Well, it could have been, though, that if he had actually done that, maybe he didn't want to give out too much information, which would pinpoint stuff, like then he could really be in trouble.
Right. Well, he was concerned because he says the only reason I'm talking now is basically, hey, I'm older and I really don't give a crap anymore. Well, I do give a crap basically, but but he says, I know I'm on the downside of my life basically. And I just want to get the story up because it's driving him nuts for all these years. And his wife was just really, she didn't know anything about it until he brought it up recently. He never mentioned all those years to her.
So they took him and let him actually see one of the aliens.
Actually, he didn't see. They didn't take him in. He walked in on the autopsy. That was going on. He said he was basically a medical assistant at the time, and he'd been stationed there. And one of his duties is to go get various medical supplies. And he said they kept him in a room off of the autopsy rooms. So he goes down to get some basic medical supplies, and he goes walking in the room, and he glances over and sees the room of the autopsy room open. The door of it open. And he, gives one of those looks in, and he sees all these military personnel, which he said one was, he termed him as a full bird colonel, was standing there, and other guys were standing there in suits. He says he's looking in. He says, then he looks at the table, and he goes, the body on the table was not human. He said it was best described as what we'd term as a gray. And there was a gray laying on a table that they were performing an autopsy on. And it was after like a few seconds, somebody looked up and saw him standing there, kind of looking in the door. And the next thing you know, that's when all heck broke loose. And he starts getting screamed at. They start going crazy, and they get him aside. They said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I'm getting medical supplies. This is part of my job. I need to get this and this and this." And he says, "I had my stuff," and he says, "I got the heck out." And one of the questions I had was, did they follow up with you? Did they take you, interrogate you? Basically get the rubber hose out, the big light, and no, nothing like that. He says, I just got the impression that I never wanted to say a word to anybody about it because just the initial beatdown he got scared the heck out of him that bad. So he says, I never said a word to anybody. Now, it's possible that, they wouldn't have had to take him to interrogate him. They just may have had people around him monitoring him to see if he had casual conversations at like the water cooler and so forth.
Right.
About what he saw. But he says, I never brought it up to anybody over all these years, even my wife.
Okay.
So would they have been following him or monitoring him for that long after the event? Since when you actually interviewed him? That's amazing.
Well, here's the about it though is see MUFON. At times, I'm not saying that their database is not secure, but somebody who's a good enough hacker can hack into a lot of things, like Also, at the time, that was about right around the time when MUFON had an agreement with Bigelow, and Bigelow actually was getting information from our database, and Bigelow was getting paid by, guess who? The Pentagon.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because that was when the ATIP program was running, the Advanced Aerial Threat Identification Program, that he was reportedly getting money, and he was conducting investigations. Matter of fact, he's probably the biggest private investigator of UFOs out there as far as an individual, putting money into stuff and investing into stuff of anybody out there. And I could just see if a report came in, via the internet that shows that, hey, there's a Wright-Patterson witness, that might have raised a red flag if anybody had access to the database. So next thing you know, hey, red flag, here's a guy at Wright-Pat that says he saw a witness or an autopsy. They could run a background probably in his name real quick and say, yeah, the guy was on the base. He was in the medical lab.
Wow.
Yeah.
I got a question from the chat room from Patsy. She wanted to know what year did this take place?
That was 1980s.
And that's when was that when you interviewed him, or was that when he actually seen it?
No, that was when he saw it. Okay. And I interviewed him now. Boy, Patsy's testing my memory on this one. That had to be about 8 years ago. At least 8 years ago now, maybe something like that. And I know that they were paranoid for me just because they're saying, hey, if this guy actually walked in on one and you've got a interview with this guy that's, really could be something, we want to make sure you make it home safe. And what I did, Henry, is, I was paranoid. Once I got home, I filmed the whole interview. I recorded. I had a camera hid. He knew about it, but we were in a restaurant, so I hid the camera from the public's view. And I recorded the whole interview, which went like 2 hours. And once I got home, I took the recording and made copies and sent them out to a couple individuals right away. That way there would be backup copies of the interviews someplace.
Well, that's a good thing to do. Yeah.
But nothing happened, and I think partially it's because, there was nothing really groundbreaking. There were just a lot of I saw this, I saw that, but when it gets down to the end of the day, there was no, there's no photographs of the alien. There's no
hardcore
other
evidence.
Artifacts. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
But interestingly enough, in potentially a related story, was when I was with the Cleveland Ufology Project, one of the former members was a medical doctor who was from Case Western Reserve. And he reportedly went to Wright-Patterson and conducted an autopsy on an alien body while he was called in reportedly by military personnel. He went down for a one-day thing. His specialty, if I remember correctly, was chemistry. And he did an analysis of the body in his own specific field. And he also said that there are a number of other individuals there that had all different specialties. Everybody did basically a one-day analysis. They turned a report in and left, and that was it. And they were never to talk about it again. And I just happened to wonder in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, what if this guy that I interviewed walked into the autopsy and who was in there but this doctor from the group here in Cleveland?
Huh.
It's wild, but it could have happened.
Sure.
Now, do you think those aliens are the ones from Roswell?
I don't know. That he didn't really know where they came from. He didn't have any idea about their origin. The only thing he said is the body itself, there was like a vault that you would store the bodies in. And he says every time he entered the room for the time he was down there, there was this lock that looked like it was welded on almost haphazard, like somebody did this as like an afterthought. Hey, we need a lock on this thing. Let's lock this vault so nobody can open it. It wasn't something that was designed that way. And he goes, that vault was always locked except for the day he walked in on the autopsy. And he says he walks in, he sees the vault open, the lock has been removed, and that's when he looked over and saw the body in the room. So his 2 and 2 together was that basically the vault contained the body and had been there all that time.
Wow.
Well, I mean, even from a human standpoint, physiologically, depending upon how long the body been there, it would still decompose pretty darn badly. Did he mention a stench?
No, he didn't mention anything about that. But based on his actions the day I talked to him, he was so scared crapless on what happened. I mean, first of all, he sees this body, it's not human, and all around the table is military personnel along with guys in suits that he had no clue who they were. So he was just completely panicking that day. And all he wanted to do was just get the heck out.
Yeah, I can believe that.
So,
because he might have disappeared conveniently after that as well.
That's true, and that's what, even in the back of his mind, he says, I'm older now, but he says he's going to get the story out and just take the chance,
So who was it that wanted... Go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to say one of my favorite aspects of the Roswell incident was, since so many neighbors and people in the town were aware when the crash happened, that an Army colonel or something showed up at one woman's house and told her if she said anything, there are miles of desert in which her body would never be found.
Yeah, and with him being in the military at that time, I mean, they could always handle another way. There could be like miles of Arctic region around it. You don't have to worry about telling anybody.
Wow.
Please don't feed the polar bears.
That's right, and accidents do happen.
So, who contacted you to do this interview with this guy?
It was actually MUFON, because he contacted MUFON himself. And once he contacts them, if they entered into a computer system, and in there it's in a computer database, they had no information really other than basically some very basic stuff about it, no real details. That's the kind of stuff I put in later to a degree. Although on some of the stuff I don't put everything in, just because to me, if prying eyes ever happen to look in there, I mean,
you don't want
I
them
want
to know
protect
everything.
the witness.
Yeah.
So here it's an interesting thing. We have all these movies now, all the books out now about MIBs, and what they look like, what their modus operandi is. Do you think has the number of MIB sightings decreased, or are they just changing how they operate and how they look to avoid detection?
From my own point of view, I think they're just kind of really trying to blend in. with everybody else and not be as noticeable. Because going back to the old days, I mean, you always talked about the guys with the black Ford Galaxies, which I had to run in back in the 60s with, the black Ford Galaxies. And the guys wearing the suits, the hats, and so forth on there. But I think now you're going to find people more blending in.
Did they choose that car model to be ironic, or?
They might have got a good deal on. I don't know. I don't know. Or maybe it goes back to Henry Ford saying that, I'll make any car you want as long as it's in black, any color you want.
As long as it's in black. Huh? Well, now, you say this was taped for MUFON. Was it a segment that was ever shown on the air, on TV?
No, nothing ever got shown on TV. It just basically went into the files and disappeared. It's been, it shouldn't really say disappeared, but it's been kept quiet. Very much, yeah.
So this is something new. Nobody's heard.
Yeah, and by the way, that was the one, I don't know if I ever told you the story before, Henry, where the guy's wife was with us during the interview. We did an interview in a Denny's in a region where he lived at because he wanted to be in a public place.
Right.
And there was a sale on those slam breakfasts.
Yeah. And his wife looked at me like something was wrong with me, when we met. And I'm like, man, is she giving me this really weird look? And I couldn't put my finger on it. Well, we did the interview for like 2 hours. And once I got done, he looked at me and I said, I looked at her and said, is something wrong? I said, you kind of giving me a strange look. And the guy spoke up and he goes, well, my wife is a psychic.
Oh.
And I said, really? And she goes, they're not done with you yet. And I said, what do you mean they're not done with me? She goes, you know who I'm talking about. They are not done with you yet.
Ooh.
They're coming for you.
And we've talked about my experiences in the past. But I'm like, man, if you were wanting to freak me out, you did a fantastic job tonight. Now I'm going to be thinking about this all the way home.
They're not done with you.
Yeah, looking out the rearview mirror.
As long as they don't decide to come here on the show and take you, or come and take all of us.
Oh, my.
I do that.
Hey, as long as they like cats and there's a lot of kitty litter, I'm all for it. Beam me up, Scotty.
Wow.
That was a wild incident that happened back then.
Yeah, well, you talk about back then, but when you consider the time frame, we were well out of the Cold War. We were well out of that era of what I would determine more like government suppression of evidence, really. So
right.
It's fascinating that there is still things. The government's still keeping an eye on this late in the game.
Yeah, it is.
Everybody's hollering crap. They're ready to go. Very interesting, though. And
well, we look at, they're making incredibly good progress with the Mars rocket, albeit it still explodes.
Well,
but
minor incident.
Just minor things.
Yeah, they learn what not to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, they had two of the other ones blow up originally, though, of the other launches, but then they got it right after that.
Right, and they're building that rocket adapter in space, aren't they?
That I don't know about. I don't know. I haven't followed SpaceX that much recently.
No. Yeah, it's still ongoing, and it looks like they're making incredibly good progress with what they call the Hopper, which I guess is the main Mars rocket, the passenger rocket anyway. So it can actually jump like a hovercraft to different space. It's kind of good.
Have they done any experiment with trying to make nuclear fuel that can power the rocket?
They've been working now on a newer nuclear engine that's in the theory stage. That's smaller, more powerful, and it's one that they're looking at potentially making the Mars trip in 6 months, I think, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Be able to make it there in 6 months, and they said it would take the round trip from like 3 years down to less than 2 or something like that.
Right. And it's interesting that with the Chernobyl event and the Fukushima event, I believe, they've discovered a certain type of mold that actually ingests radioactive material. So you could develop a skin for a spaceship that would basically eat up all of the solar radiation, which was another big part of the whole Mars thing. Is it took 3 years. That's 3 years of exposure to gamma ray. I'm not sure how good that would be on the astronauts.
You just created this vision in my mind real quick, Barbara. It's kind of off topic of, what was it, the Jim Carrey movie? Dumb and Dumber.
Dumb and Dumber.
where they had that car with the carpet and stuff all over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just picture here's a spaceship going up all this mold on that looks like that car.
The other option is they go up without mold, they come back exposure to gamma rays, we'd have a bunch of Hulks running around. So
That's true. That is true.
Wow. Well, I got a thing here that we wanted to discuss because I got 1,000 questions with it. But about 2 weeks ago, I was watching a program on TV, and all of a sudden, Patsy started hollering, "Look, it's Thomas!" And I said, "What?" And she backed it up and started playing it again. And it had a segment where you were being interviewed. And I'll tell people what it is. It's UFO Witness, and it was season 1, episode 1, called Secrets of the State. And you were being interviewed in this about a helicopter that something had happened to it. Apparently these guys didn't do all that much research into everything. And I guess to start with, why don't you just tell people, well, I guess the first part of the segment was dealing with the Nimitz, when the guys locked in on a UFO and all of a sudden it just shot off to the left real fast out of sight. But right after that, you were on and you were talking about another incident that had took place. So why don't you tell us about that, how it come about, and what it was all supposedly had happened?
Well, what they did is they contacted me about the show. Really, it's probably a year and a half to 2 years ago now, something like that. They reached out to me, and what they were interested in is somebody who knew something about what's referred to as the Coin helicopter case from 1973. And the helicopter event involved a Army Reserve helicopter was flying from Columbus to Cleveland, Ohio on October 18th. Well, I've researched that case a lot, and I happened to live at that time, Henry, in that region where that happened at. So I remember back in 1973 when all the thing originally happened is the next day the newspapers came out. They said there was a UFO seen, basically right in our backyard. And it involved an Army Reserve helicopter. And what happened is this helicopter was returning back from Columbus to Cleveland at night. It was roughly right around probably 10:45, 11 o'clock at night. It was clear, starless, beautiful night, a little chilly night. The helicopter is roughly right around 1,500 feet. When one of the crewmen, his name was John Healy, he actually looked out the left side window as they're heading north. And he sees a red light off in a distance, and he doesn't think a whole lot about it. He sees this red light kind of passing at a distance, and he noticed it wasn't blinking like a tower would be. Also wasn't blinking like an aircraft. It was just a solid red light. Well, about a minute and a half later, right around Richland County, Ohio, another crewman in the back seat, his name is Robert Janicek. He looked out the right side window, and he sees a red light off in the distance. The same thing. He thought it was maybe a tower, maybe another aircraft off in the distance. Didn't think a whole lot about it, and then he kept watching it, and it was pacing him. So he notified the pilot, the commander of the flight, who was Lawrence Coyne, Colonel Coyne is what he ended up as, but he notified the commander. He says, hey, there's this this light off in the distance. Looks like it's pacing us. Could be an aircraft. I'm not sure. He says, well, keep an eye on it because you got a pretty good view at it. He says, keep an eye on it. Let me know what happens. Well, he says, not long after that, the light started heading directly at him at a high rate of speed. They said it was coming in at a speed that wasn't supersonic, but it appeared to be maybe 400 to 500 miles an hour. And at that time, there were fighters stationed at Mansfield-Lahm Airport that were Air Force jets, reserve jets. And they thought maybe this was a jet coming in, that even though they shouldn't have been flying at that speed, that maybe there was something going on and there was a jet potentially coming at them. They tried to contact Mansfield. They got initial response that Mansfield heard them, then their radio went dead. And the next thing you know, Henry, this light, which is coming at a high rate of speed, stops in front and above them. According to one of the crewmen, I talked to one of the crewmen. His name was Robert Janicek. I actually talked to two of them. Janicek said he thought that the thing was close enough that the helicopter was going to hit the rotor blades. And he was actually paranoid of that. But this green light came on and engulfed the cockpit. And the crew didn't notice it, but the helicopter went from like 1,500 feet up to 3,500 feet. Even though the captain, Captain Coyne, who was flying the helicopter at the time, had put the helicopter in a descent. And at the lowest point they knew, they were roughly about 500 feet off the ground. And next thing you know, this green light comes on and they end up at 3,500 feet with no turbulence. They didn't feel any impression that anything was going on. They were focused on the light. The light then goes out, and they continue on. They realize that, hey, we're at a higher altitude than we should be. They dropped back to the original altitude and went on to Cleveland. Well, that's the very basic details of the case. But what the show wanted to do was dig in deeper to that incident. So they reached out to not only me, but they reached out to Jenny Zeidman. Jenny Zeidman worked, they listed her as working with Project Blue Book, but I'm not sure that's exactly correct. She actually worked with Alan Hynek, who was the consultant to Blue Book. Originally going back to about 1952, I believe it was, she took a class from Hynek. And he was involved with the UFOs back then. He used to challenge some of his students with some of these things that he was seeing about UFOs. Well, he posed a question on an incident that he was involved with, and she identified what it most likely was. And he was impressed with that. So eventually later on, she actually became an assistant to him. Well, Jenny Zeidman did the investigation on the original investigation on the Coyne case. She's got a book out on it that she put out. Well, the show contacted her and got her original research, which a number of things I hadn't heard before. She had some audio recordings with the crew, which I also did. I've had some of my own on there that I got from other sources, original recordings where the crew were interviewed. And she brought out some of her research. Well, Jenny Zeidman unfortunately passed away last April. April of last year. And I don't know what happened to all of her research, but they had her involved with it, which I thought was great. So what they were doing is taking and reviewing the case, but they were pointing out potential similarities between the object that the crew observed and what was going on with the Pentagon incident with the Nimitz, I should say the Nimitz case, going back to the UFOs being seen off the coast of California. They were pointing out the similarities of potential shape of the object. The crew in this helicopter case pointed out that the object left heading kind of in a northwest direction. They were pointing out in the Nimitz case on how the object kind of like took off screen and disappeared. So they're looking at similarities to try to tie these two events potentially together, that it may have been the same craft. So that was kind of like the point of where I came in at. Well, the thing I did like, Henry, is with what was on like right before I came in, is I talked to Robert Janacek. I talked to him for 2-3 hours, and he's also, by the way, since passed away, so they couldn't get him to interview him for the show. I provided him his information, but when they reached out to him, they found out he'd passed. I've got a lengthy interview of him where we reenacted basically the whole case, went through all the details. He gave me a lot of information. John Healy, one of the other crewmen, reportedly is passed away, but I'm questioning that myself because they reached out to somebody named John Healy who said it wasn't him, but I'm kind of questioning if that really wasn't him when they showed me a picture of who they talked to. But they did reach out to Rick Jesse, who was one of the crewmen I hadn't talked to. I thought I knew where he was at, and they reached out to the guy, and it was him. And they had a lengthy interview with Rick on the show where he basically went through highlighting the same details of what Janacek did with me. And Jesse was the guy who was actually flying the helicopter that day. So he told his side of the story, which matched what I'd heard, basically. And what they picked me up about was the book basically reenacted the whole event. It pointed out ground witnesses that they'd confirmed they'd also seen a helicopter, that the helicopter was seen at roughly about, by witnesses on the ground, that they saw the helicopter at about 500 feet. They saw the green light come up. They saw the helicopter being elevated and going up in the air. Then they saw the light go off and the object kind of disappear off in the distance. So he had confirmation from ground witnesses, but the story pretty much ended there. They had some other details in the book about that Jenny Zeidman wrote about potential effects on the crew. Well, what I did is I picked my story up and went back and talked about a number of these things with Janacek, and some other things popped out. Plus, I also researched a helicopter to find out what happened to it, because I thought, here's a helicopter. I mean, what if this thing is around someplace? And what if you went back to it? The helicopter, by the way, is made in 1968. I checked its serial numbers out and stuff. What if you found the helicopter? And what if the helicopter had trace evidence on it? Because what was interesting at the time, Henry, is the helicopter, they said that it had gone from like 1,500 feet to 3,500 feet. The next day after that event, they checked the radio out because they said that the radio had been acting up. They also said the compass the next day was spinning and wouldn't quit spinning, and they replaced the compass. And I thought, well, what if they've had ongoing issues of stuff like that ever since? Well, I found out that the compass, when it was replaced, they considered it something like a non-major type of piece of equipment. In my mind, it would be, but the reports were basically destroyed after like so many days. They didn't keep record of it, of that type of repair. The radio, had evidently been checked out, replaced. The crewmen, two of the crewmen told me personally that the compass had issues, the radio had issues, and the crewman basically told me that the helicopter became basically a hangar queen that had ongoing mechanical issues after that. The day following the event, by the way, they also did what's called a magnaflux test on the blades of the helicopter, the mechanical parts, to look for stress fractures. And I thought that was extremely odd that also you've got this UFO event, and the next day they come back and they do all this testing looking for fractures, for stresses. Why would you do that? That seems to be well beyond a coincidence to me. It seems like they suspected maybe something happened that may have formed stress fractures. Nothing ever came out that they found anything. When they checked out the tapes from Mansfield to see if they'd actually heard the radio from the helicopter, there was no record of any acknowledgement of the radio, even though Captain Coyne said there was an acknowledgement. There were no records there. So it regularly made me start questioning a lot of stuff.
So let me ask here, did any of the helicopters at that time use camera?
No.
The way fighter pilots do?
No, they had nothing on there like that.
And did they, when you talk about recordings, you're talking about radio recordings that go back to the base and somebody is recording there? It's not done at the...
You could have somebody recording at the base, but some of the recordings I was referring to earlier also were interviews of the crew at the time. Because I've got a recording of Hynek interviewing the crew, a couple of the crew members in Cleveland after the event happened. She also had recordings of her interviews with the crew at that time, Coyne and them. And it's an extremely interesting case. And I mean, I was looking for the helicopter. I thought, what if I could find the helicopter? So I started Googling the tail number. Found out that the tail number, when it had been manufactured, that they took about 40 helicopters out of service at the same time that were about the same age, a number of helicopters. And it looked like they were taking them out of service because of age. They not only took them out of service, but they reassigned them civilian tail numbers. The civilian tail number was also reassigned to a Colombian tail number. And what they did is there is basically like a agreement going on with Colombia where we're going to basically supply them helicopters for drug trafficking down there. So the helicopters went to Patrick Air Force Base down in Florida. Then they went to Colombia. And what was really wild about the whole thing is, I'm checking this out, and I come across an article where that tail number had crashed in the jungle in Colombia while it was reportedly doing a drug trafficking raid. And that all 4 crewmen were dead. And one of my initial thoughts was, I didn't want to jump the gun, but what if the helicopter wasn't shot down? Because they did have small arms fire down there trying to bring down these helicopters. But what if mechanical issues developed? And this is why the helicopter went down. And what if nobody had, any knowledge or mechanical issues? Because reportedly the service records of the helicopters go along with them, but I couldn't verify that. What if, this helicopter is found to have compass issues, also radio issues, potential mechanical issues, and the records weren't there that anybody would even know what was going on with that helicopter? I tried to reach out to a reporter in Colombia, and he wouldn't respond. The guy who did the story down there, I told him what was going on, and he never responded back. But then I started digging even farther, Barbara, and found WikiLeaks documents where it was reporting that here its monthly reports, it sounded like Vietnam. There's monthly reports of how many acres were being sprayed with defoliants to basically kill the marijuana crops and drug crops that they were finding down there. They reported that if there was any arms fire against the helicopters. They reported mechanical issues, how many helicopters in service, how many were out of service. I mean, here they were giving fairly detailed records going back and forth. And I found the records for the time frame when the helicopter reportedly crashed, and there was no document that named that specific helicopter actually crashing. So here I questioned, did the helicopter really go down, or is this just a cover-up story to show that, hey, it's gone? I found another helicopter by a completely different number had crashed, and the crew had perished, but not that one.
So apparently they didn't actually do real good research on this story before they did all this.
Well, I gave them a lot of stuff, but I think it ends up at the end of the day is they were saying, okay, this is important to us, this is important to us, this is important, and some of the other stuff just basically didn't have time to put everything in. I think that's what part of it was. Because one of the things I brought up to him is I said, in my interviews with Janacek, I said, I remember reading in Jenny Zeidman's book that Coyne was questioned about missing time, basically, or actually out-of-body experience. Let me rephrase it that way, out-of-body experiences. And I'm like, out-of-body experiences? Well, when I talked to Janacek, he knew nothing about Jenny Zeidman's book. He'd never seen it. So he didn't have any knowledge what was in it. And I said, got a question to ask you, Robert. I said, did you ever get asked at any time about having out-of-body experiences? And he looked at me kind of funny and goes, yeah. He says, actually, Captain Coyne talked to us about that. I said, really? He said, yeah, he asked me about that one day, and he says, I really thought that was weird. Why would he ask me about out-of-body experiences, having strange dreams and stuff like that? I'm like, really? Well, reportedly, the Surgeon General office had asked him to ask the crew, each of them, that specific question. Now, why would you ask somebody that unless you suspected something? I mean, here's a helicopter encounter with an unknown object. Why would you ask them, the crew, about having out-of-body experiences afterwards? Unless you knew that maybe there was a correlation with some other events that they'd come across.
Did they have any missing time?
Well, see, that's another thing that I wish they could have worked in the show. Because I told them about the fact that, when after they saw the UFO left. They were right around Ashland County, which put them about 50 miles out from Cleveland Hopkins Airport, and that's where they were based at the time. Not long after they left the UFO encounter, they started having master caution lights coming on. And that was what Janacek told me. He says the master caution light starts going on. Well, I had diagrams and stuff of, the panels and stuff. And I said, what specifically? He says, well, low fuel. When that alarm goes off, he says, basically you've got X number of minutes fuel remaining. And he says, you better set it down quick. Well, one of the thoughts I had right away is I said, okay, so the helicopter's returning from Columbus. I didn't really know the range of the helicopter. I researched it. And I remember I was like, was it 400 and some miles, something like that, is what it was projected to go on their fuel. I said, when you left Cleveland, you got to Columbus, did you refuel? He goes, no, we didn't refuel, because he says Coyne had flown that flight hundreds of times, and he'd never had to refuel. Well, now they're not even all the way back yet, and they've got master caution lights going on with low fuel. So he says, we're getting paranoid that the thing is going to run out of fuel before we ever get back to Cleveland. That's what he was telling me. He says, So, I mean, basically they're panicking. Finally, they come into Cleveland, and per his comments, they never had permission to land at Cleveland Hopkins Airport. Now, whether it was kind of lost in the confusion that they tried to radio contact them, because reportedly they got reestablished radio contact at some point, not with Mansfield, but Akron Canton Airport. But he says, when we sat down at Cleveland, we had no permission to land. We sat down. Next thing you know, here comes security flying up to us, wondering who we are and what we're doing. And he says the most terror he was in the whole flight was when that alarm came off, knowing that they only had X number of minutes of fuel remaining. And he says, basically, when they checked the tanks later on, they only had like 5 gallons of fuel left.
Wow.
When they sat down. So they're at any point, they were running so much on fumes at that point, it wasn't funny.
Yeah.
But the question is okay, it's assuming that, the tanks have been topped off like they should have been before they left. They'd flown this trip, Coyne had flown it hundreds of times, never had an issue of fuel. Why would this flight use way more fuel than what other flights had?
Could have there been strong headwinds?
The way they talked at night was completely calm. There were no strong winds. There were no strong winds. The question I would have is when they had the encounter with the UFO, when it had gone up, could have then been their potential time of a point of missing time, that they were basically suspended there longer than they thought.
Did they have wristwatches on to be able to track time and see that?
That's a good question, Henry. There's no note of anything regarding the time. None I could find.
Then they wouldn't know if they had missing time or not.
No. And could it be potentially that the helicopter is almost fighting forces of the object too and using up more fuel?
Yeah, it's possible.
It's possible. But I'm like, that was an area that was kind of missed. You've got a helicopter using way more fuel than what it should have.
I'm interested in the out-of-body stuff, because it would seem to me that the question was leading towards were you abducted and possibly restrained to the point where it seemed like an out-of-body experience?
Mm-hmm.
And not an actual out-of-body experience.
Right. There was
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. When I talked to Jesse, there was no reference to anything like that. He had no memories of anything like that. No discussion of unusual dreams. To his knowledge, he didn't have any.
Not like you, huh?
But no, not like me. But he just thought it was kind of strange, so that out of the blue, here comes this question about, are you having strange dreams after it's happened? One of the ones I would want to know more from would be maybe like Healy. If he was if he's around, reportedly he's passed, but did he have those out-of-body experiences? And it makes you wonder, Honor Barbara, the question may have come up because maybe Coyne had some, maybe one of the other crewmen had some, like Healy had some. That came back up through the medical reports, and so they said, wait a minute, if this guy has it, maybe other ones have too.
So it would be a really interesting process, and I'm not sure, well, the government wouldn't do it, but of those pilots who have seen UFOs or had experiences, if someone went back to do some research to ask them if they ever recalled any other abduction experiences. And do you think you could be linking them to one of the crew actually being a prior abductee?
They could be looking for something like that. I couldn't find any evidence of the crew itself having any other experiences. Healy, he was actually a Cleveland policeman, a detective. Coyne was actually a Cleveland policeman at one time. before he went full-time in the service. Janacek worked for Pitney Bowes, if I remember correctly. He worked for them for years, and he was actually the baby of the group. He was only like 23 when this whole thing happened. And he hit the very tail end of Vietnam. Coyne was a guy who had like 19 years experience or something like that.
Okay.
But the thing is, Coyne, though, was one that really was pursuing this whole thing more later on regarding the whole UFO situation, because he's one that hooked up with not only Alan Hynek, but he made an appearance at the United Nations when they had a session where they discussed UFOs back. This had to be like 1980, something like that, probably 70s, 80s. And he was one that, was, I guess you could say, more aggressive at it. I mean, going that far to talk about UFOs. And by the way, when he made the appearance at the United Nations meeting that time, the United States didn't sponsor him to the meeting. It was actually another country sponsored him.
Well, now, other than just seeing a light, they wasn't able to see any type of a UFO.
They saw the light. They said they could make out the appearance of something. They said there was like a white light on the front, a red light on the back. All right, take it back. Let me reverse that. Red light on the front, white light on the back. And they could make out what appeared to be like a metallic surface from like the light that was coming off of it.
Glowing, yeah.
Yeah, it said it appeared to be like a metallic surface on this object.
Could they tell how big it was?
Going out of memory here, it had to be right around the size of the helicopter, slightly larger than the helicopter, from what they said. And when I looked over Zeidman's book, she had some diagrams where like the object was in front of him. But when I talked to Janacek, he actually said that the object was more above. Like in the helicopter, you've got these windows above the pilot and the co-pilot. The windows are tinted like a green. They actually call the cockpit the greenhouse, because if light comes in, it kind of illuminates the things as the cockpit as being green. And I remember on the show, Jesse said that the light was white that he saw, but other ones were saying it was green, and it could have been because the white light going through the green tinted windows.
Right.
In the upper part of the helicopter.
Well, if this thing was kind of like above them a little bit, you think it would have had to do like that to be able to pull the helicopter up?
Yeah, it would. To me, it would correlated with something trying to pull something up if it's in front and ahead of them. And also, when they're talking about going forward, I mean, if you just throw a very rough speed of, let's say, 100 miles an hour, roughly, they're going forward at roughly 100 miles an hour, where the object had to also be going forward with them at that time. If it's kind of like keeping pace with them.
Very interesting.
But this one had a number of questions. I would like to see them, if we could find more information. I've been told that there could have been still potentially radar data from that time frame. I haven't been able to find anything. But if something would have popped up potentially on radar. And I also, by the way, go ahead, Barbara.
You'd also think that somewhere down the line there's maintenance records.
Yeah, and that's what I was really going after when I contacted the Colombian reporter, to see if maintenance records could be discovered. And he wouldn't respond, and that area in Colombia is a high area for drug trafficking. And I know I wouldn't go down there to investigate.
Good idea.
I know that's for sure.
No, I wouldn't either.
But there are just so many questions about this whole thing, and unfortunately, it's now you have the crew passing away. So there goes your biggest source of information.
It's the same with Roswell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jesse, when he talked, I haven't seen him talk before. And I would like to see all the rest of the interview that they did with him, because to me, when we did the scene in the restaurant, it was I jokingly call it like 5 minutes of fame or something like that. But we were there probably for like 3-4 hours doing stuff. And I'd like to hear all the other stuff that didn't make the air. Mm. Although maybe he didn't have that much else, because I think he's kind of guarded. I tried to reach out once. I had somebody else who tried to reach out to him who was former military, and he never responded. But this may have been a one-time thing for him, and talking about it maybe never again in public.
All right. We got tons more to talk about this. And we have some questions from the chat room. I think we'll get to those right after break. So I think it's about that time. We're going to take us a quick break, and we'll be back in about 6 minutes, something like that. So just remember, your mics are live. Just don't say anything. We'll be back in just a minute.
So you're listening to the Paranormal... Oh, are you just going...
No, go ahead. Take us out.
Okay, so you're listening to the Paranormal View on para-x.com with your hosts, Henry Foister, Ceiling Cat Barbara Duncan, and myself, Jeffrey Gould, with tonight's always excellent, wonderful guest, Thomas Wertman. So stay tuned for more of the Paranormal View after the break.